This year's budget has been difficult both for the City Council and the staff, mainly because, like so many other cities nationally and in the state of Colorado and here in the region, we are suffering a reduction of revenues, and it is affecting our ability to provide services at the level at which our community is generally prepared to receive them. Sales tax has several different categories, so if you included building use tax and there is no building, it would be, roughly 45 to 50% of our budget depending on the year. And our building revenues actually held up fairly well, ironically, because of the July 20th hailstorm and all of the roofing permits and all of the use tax, which is a form of sales tax, which is associated with that. As far as the general retail sales tax, we have not fared as poorly as the rest of the region, mostly because our sales tax base is so elemental. That is, we don't have a lot of high-end stores, and we're mostly grocery store-based strip malls, plus home improvements and discount stores. That's oversimplifying, obviously. But because of that, and to get to your point, we are off about 3.5% for the year. There's intergovernmental transfers. So, for example, the state collects the money for the Highway Users Tax Fund. There are grants that come from the federal government, such as the Community Development Block Grant Fund. We receive an annual allocation from Jefferson County Open Space for parks development, maintenance, and acquisition, open space and trails. So there are, if one were to look at the Arvada budget in the overall, you would see many different funding sources. But the major sources really are sales tax, use taxes, fees that we collect for services provided, and intergovernmental grants, and to a lesser extent, surprisingly, I think to a lot of folks, property tax, which is quite a small number compared to the city's overall budget. I think most people would be surprised to know that. There are a couple of different calculations that we go through relative to budgeting in the city. The city charter requires an annual budget, so we really revisit these numbers every year. We do a two-year budget that the council adopts, which really is probably the longest possible period to reasonably be able to forecast revenues and expenditures. So we do adopt a two-year budget. And then finally, to your question about the five-year model, we, for the purposes of financial planning, not unlike you would do with your family budget, or certainly people who are thinking about retirement or a college fund or whatever, we try to, as best we can, anticipate what the city's revenues and expenses might be for 5 years out. What that does for us is that it it kind of informs us or gives us advice as to whether or not it would be a good idea to start a program, add an employee, buy a new truck, because if you understand the expense of that over the time, whether or not the revenues support that over time, maybe you will decide not to take that next step and start that new program or hire that new employee. So that's the value of the model. It's sort of like family financial planning, really. Our reserves at this point are actually quite healthy. We're in the process of closing the books on 2009 right now, so we don't actually know the number precisely. But probably a fairly good ballpark number is that the city's cash reserves are in the neighborhood of 30 to 33 million, probably closer to $33 million. Of that, there is about 25 million to 26 million, which is budgeted, actually budgeted as reserves and used in that 5-year model of forward planning. The other roughly 7 to 7.5 million is actually an undesignated surplus that was the result last year of taking an extremely close look at all of the city's funds and accounts, and more or less, to use a phrase, sweeping out those accounts, and and then aggregating all that money into one place. What I need to emphasize about both of those numbers, whether it's the larger number of 25, 26 million, or the smaller number of 7, they are reserves, whether they're designated or undesignated, and as such, they're one-time money. Once they're spent, just like a rainy day fund, once it's spent, it's gone. We don't have ongoing revenues to replenish that necessarily. Energy cost is probably one of the brighter spots of the city's budget because 4 years ago, our facilities manager, Phil Hensley, and other folks around City Hall undertook an effort to retrofit all of our city facilities to make them more energy efficient. And so the result of that has actually been a fairly significant savings against what the bill might have been had we not undertaken these efforts. So as an example, in the first full year that we could measure, which was, I believe, the year before last, our savings were approximately 140,000. And of that, 90,000 went to kind of pay for the financing the retrofit, and the other 50,000 was true savings to the general fund budget. And those are savings which we can forecast forward. I don't know the number from '09 yet. Our cost savings efforts began in September of '08. And I need to start there because that's when the credit markets melted down. When it became obvious that we had not only had a big problem, but that it was probably ongoing. So in that year, in that 4 months, that last 4 months, our departments were able to save over $600,000 by just cutting back everywhere, anticipating that '09 wasn't going to be too much better. And then during this past year, again, having not closed the books yet, and we won't until next week, but it appears that the expense savings for last year will be in the neighborhood of probably $2 to $3 million. All the cutbacks that people made efforts at during this past year. That said, though, we need to go back to the revenue side and say, okay, but how much are revenues affected? We literally budgeted to use about 2.5 million of our reserves this year in order to maintain services, not knowing exactly where the economy is going, and of course, who does? And so if we were to account for our reduced revenues, the department's savings, even though we budgeted about 2.5 million into our reserves, we probably will only use about 1.3 million into our reserves. Now, that number isn't in the right direction, obviously, it's a negative, but nevertheless, it's a better number than we thought we might. As we go forward now, so having said that, as we go forward into 2010, we balanced our budget on very conservative revenues, as you might guess, reduced expenditures that were continuing those from '08 and '09, and still, though, planned to use about $1.6 million of our reserves again this year. Clearly we're not sure where we're going this year. Nobody really is. We hope for a better year than last year. And it is possible that we could come out even or better to the end of the year, assuming the departments continue their efforts at savings. But then we don't know where our revenues are going. That's the big problem.